Hello, my name's Tony Bradman and I write children's books. You may have seen some of them, certainly if you're in a school. Anglo-Saxon Boy, Viking Boy, and the non-fiction companion book to that. And Bruno and Frida, which is up for a Young Quills Historical Association award. It's shortlisted for an award this year. But what I wanted to talk to you today about was this one, Operation Banana. Strange title, but there is a reason for that. I started off as a writer, writing poetry and picture books, but I always wanted to write longer fiction, and in recent years I've got into writing a lot of historical fiction. And I've always thought that one of the reasons that I wanted to write historical fiction was that both my parents are of the war generation, and they were born in the 20s, lived through the 30s, the Great Depression, the rise of fascism and communism, and the Second World War, and they were kids in the Blitz in London, both living in London, and by the end of the war they were both old enough to be in the services. My mum was a Wren in the Women's Royal Navy, my dad was a sailor in the Royal Navy. He was on HMS Belfast, saw action in the North Atlantic and the Far East, and my mum was based at Fort Southwick, which was kind of one of the big HQs for D-Day, and they both did lots of other stuff as well. And I kind of grew up with them in the 50s, listening to stories, 50s and 60s, listening to stories of their childhoods in the war. They told lots of stories about things that they remembered, and I was always struck by how personal it was for them. Yes, huge Titanic historical events, but it was a personal thing for them, the bombing, the rationing, going without food, the worry, all of those things were felt deeply, particularly by children, I think. And the young families, young mums who are at home having to work in factories and keep things going while their partners were away, fighting overseas, and the kids who saw how the strain on the grown-ups in their lives. So when I got to writing historical fiction, I did write some stories about the First World War and Second World War, but I always wanted to write a very, very personal story. So I came up with the idea for Operation Banana because I wanted to write a story that actually explored what it might have felt like to be young at that time. And the heroine of my story, Susan, is living with her mum in London, and her dad, Susan's dad, is off fighting in El Alamein. And I set it around November 1942, halfway through the war, although, as Susan says, they didn't know that then. They didn't know it was halfway. There was still a long way to go, but they didn't know when it was going to finish. And for a lot of families who had dads, sons, brothers fighting overseas, they didn't hear them for months on end, so all they did was worry about them. And I sort of set up the story with Susan worried about her mum, because her mum's really depressed, having to work too hard, worried about dad overseas. It's just never ending. They've been through the Blitz, had to shelter in the underground, and mum's just desperately unhappy, and it opens at tea time one night when mum burst into tears because she just can't take it anymore. So Susan, being the lovely kid that she is, decides she's going to cheer her mum up and talks to her mate at school, and Jimmy, and they decide to go off. Susan decides to go off and get her mum a treat. They think we'll get her something nice to eat. So they pick on bananas, because no one had seen a banana for years during the wars. You couldn't get them. And like oranges, anything that came from overseas that was kind of slightly different. So they set off on a quest to find a banana, and that's why it's called Operation Banana. What I wanted to do was explore what London was like, show what it was like, the dirt, the ruins, the squalor, the worry, and also there are other sides to the war. I mean, in many ways it was their finest hour, to use the Churchillian phrase. But there was a lot of bad stuff going on as well. Wherever there's shortages, there's crime. The black market was doing a roaring trade. And if you knew the right dodgy geezers, you could certainly find whatever you wanted. So that's part of the plot of the story. So it's sort of setting the scene in London and that period of the war. And it's kind of like a tribute to all those people who suffered on the home front and struggled just to get by. And they were important too. They helped win the war. And really, in a lot of ways, it was about them. Although, of course, the people who were fighting overseas, that was they were doing a terrific job as well. But that's what the story's about. It really focuses on Susan and her mum. So I have a writing challenge for you, and that writing challenge is that I would like you to put yourself in Susan's shoes. Imagine you're in war-torn Britain in November 1942, and you're desperately worried about your mum, and you want to do something to cheer her up. So what one thing would you do or acquire or get to cheer up your mum? What obstacles would be put in your path, or what obstacles would be in your path in doing that? And how far would you go in overcoming those obstacles to do what you wanted to do? So that's the challenge. And my little book is really a tribute to all those people. It's kind of a memory of my mum and dad. It's dedicated to them. They're both long gone. But I like to think that they would be pleased to know that I'm talking about them today to you, and also they'd enjoy reading the book. I hope you do too.